The night was merciless. Nora pressed her knees to her chest, trying to silence the growl of her stomach. A stranger lay beside her, their breaths forming clouds in the frozen air. No introductions, no pasts. Just two broken souls bound by hunger, sharing one thin blanket against the world. By day, Nora's eyes told a story the streets could never erase. She once carried notebooks filled with towers and skylines only her imagination could reach. Each page was a promise, each line a future. She swore she'd build. But those dreams, once so alive, now lay buried under the weight of rejection and loss. She hadn't chosen the sidewalk. Life had cornered her there. Her father's debts, failed promises, and a society quick to mock her ambition left her with nothing but memories of graphite-stained fingers and sleepless nights of drawing. On the streets, people didn't see an architect. They saw just another shadow begging for warmth. Yet deep inside, Nora clung to one fragile belief, that her punishment wasn't permanent. The city may have stolen her home, her books, her comfort, but it hadn't stolen her vision. Malik never. Ask Nora where she came from, and she never asked him either. The streets didn't care for histories. They only cared for who could endure the longest. At first he was just another shape curled up beside her, another forgotten face under the street lamp's dim glow. But nights have a way of stitching, strangers together. He noticed how she tried to hide her trembling hands when hunger clawed at her. She noticed how he tore a stale piece of bread in half, even when he had nothing else for himself. Their silence became its own language. A nod, a glance, a shared blanket against the bitter wind. Malik wasn't family. He wasn't friend. But he was there. And sometimes, presence alone is the thin thread that keeps a dreamer from unraveling completely. Hunger became their clock. Morning began with empty stomachs. Night ended with unanswered prayers. Nora's shoes had holes so wide the cold seeped in, blistering her feet as she wandered from shop to shop, begging for work. Each rejection was sharper than the last, not because of the words, but because of the eyes that looked at her like she was invisible. Malik scavenged through trash bins, returning with scraps of bread or bruised fruit. He'd placed them in her hands before eating anything himself. She wanted to cry, but instead she forced a smile, whispering, "We'll make it. Somehow." It wasn't food that kept them alive. It was that fire she carried, a refusal to let despair own her completely. She gave Malik a reason to believe there was more than this street, more than this suffering. And in that exchange, their survival became less about hunger of the body, and more about hunger of the soul. One morning, after yet another night of hunger, Nora gathered the courage to step inside a construction office. Her hair was uncombed, her shoes torn, but her heart carried sketches she'd drawn on scraps of paper, rescued from the trash. She spread them out on the table, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Give me a chance, I can design better than this." The men inside looked at her, then at her broken sandals, then back at each other. Their laughter cracked through the room like a whip. "A girl with no roof over her head wants to build towers," one sneered. Another shook his head, mocking, "Go fix your shoes before you fix our buildings." Every word was a blade. Malik stood outside watching through the glass door as Nora lowered her gaze, clutching her papers like they were shards of her soul. She didn't cry. She didn't fight back. She only gathered the torn dignity she had left and walked out in silence. But humiliation has two faces, one that breaks you and one that burns you alive until you rise. For Nora, that moment planted fire in her chest that no laughter could ever kill. That night the city was loud, neon signs buzzing, footsteps echoing, bottles clinking in alleyways. Nora and Malik sat by the curb, their bodies pressed against the cold bricks, when two men staggered out of a bar nearby. Their voices were careless, dripping with arrogance. They spoke of millions, budgets, contracts, deadlines. To them it was drunken chatter. To Nora it was a puzzle. As the numbers spilled from their mouths, her mind caught fire. She pieced them together, calculating faster than she could breathe. And in seconds, she knew. Their grand boasts didn't add up. Her heart pounded. For years she thought she was only a dreamer, cursed to watch her visions die in notebooks. But here, on a dirty street corner, she discovered something the world hadn't seen yet. Her mind wasn't just capable. It was sharper than the very men sitting in offices who laughed at her. Malik turned to her, confused at first, then stunned by the sudden glow in her eyes. Hunger had dimmed her spirit so many times before, but now he saw something different. Not despair, not pain, hope, fierce, unstoppable hope. The city had gone quiet, its noise fading into a distant hum. Nora sat back against the rough wall, her mind still buzzing from the numbers she'd overheard. For the first time in months, her chest didn't feel hollow. It felt alive. She turned to Malik, her closest stranger, her only witness. His face was tired, drawn by hunger and endless nights, but his eyes still carried the gentleness of someone who refused to abandon her side. Nora's throat tightened as she whispered, "If I ever rise, you'll rise with me." Her voice trembled, but the promise was carved deeper than stone. It wasn't casual, it wasn't desperate. It was a vow born from survival, forged by the pavement beneath their bodies. Malik didn't reply with words. He simply nodded, eyes glistening in the dim glow of the street lamp. For once, they weren't just two broken souls enduring the night. They were partners in a promise, and as the cold air pressed down on them, something new settled between their tired bodies. Not despair, not fear, hope. Hope thick enough to wrap around them like a second blanket. The promise became fuel. Nora refused to let her talent rot in silence. With scraps of paper gathered from trash bins and pencils worn down to stubs, she began to draw again. Simple storefronts, clean layouts, practical designs. Nothing like the towers in her dreams, but it was a start. By day, she walked from shop to shop offering her services for just a handful of coins. Most scoffed, some slammed the door in her face, but a few, just a few, saw something in her. Rough sketches. Enough to say, "Fine, show me." At night, she worked under the flicker of a dim streetlight, her fingers stained with ink, her body trembling from tea instead of food. Malik became her legs when hers could walk no more. He carried her drawings from one office to another, refusing to let rejection be the final word. Every page she filled wasn't just a design. It was survival. It was proof that even on the coldest pavement, she could still lay the first brick of a future no one else believed she deserved. After weeks of slammed doors and mocking stares, one tired shopkeeper paused as Nora laid her sketches on the counter. He studied the lines, the angles, the precision carved into every page. Unlike others, he didn't laugh. He leaned forward, squinting, and muttered, "All right, let's try it." For the next few nights, Nora worked like her. Life depended on it, because it did. Ink bled through the thin paper as she drew, erased, and redrew until the plan felt alive. Malik watched her hands tremble, yet never let her falter. He delivered tea, guarded her from strangers, and reminded her why she started. When the design was built, it transformed the small shop. Customers poured in, drawn by the neat layout, the flow of space, the unseen brilliance that only Nora could envision. For the first time, someone didn't toss her a coin out of pity. They paid her with pride, shaking her hand like she mattered. Standing outside that shop, Nora's chest swelled. It wasn't a tower, it wasn't her dream skyline, but it was proof. Proof that a girl once laughed at like trash could carve her name into stone. And in her eyes, this wasn't just work. It was the first crack of light breaking through the dark. Her small win had barely settled when the shadows closed in. A contractor who once brushed her off suddenly returned, all smiles, pretending to be impressed. He asked to review her, drawings praising her skill with syrupy words. Hungry for trust, Nora handed them over. Days later, she stood frozen as the city hammered steel into her lines, her vision rising brick by brick, but under his name. The sketches she had poured her nights into were paraded as his brilliance. Malik wanted to storm into his office, fists clenched, ready for a fight, but Nora stopped him. She had no money, no lawyers, no power. All she had was her will. And instead of letting the betrayal break her, she swallowed the pain like iron. "Let him build with my hands," she whispered. "I'll build something greater with my soul." The theft scarred her, but it also gave her armor, The shop's glow faded. The coins were gone and betrayal had stripped her bare once more. Nora and Malik returned to the only place that never turned them away, the sidewalk. The same cracked pavement, the same thin blanket. But something had shifted. Before, the streets crushed her spirit. Now, they sharpened it. She no longer stared at the ground in defeat. She looked at the city lights as if they were enemies she would one day conquer. Each skyscraper towering above her wasn't a reminder of her failure. It was a challenge, daring her to rise. Malik studied her in silence, noticing the fire in her eyes. She wasn't weeping, wasn't pleading. She was planning. The hunger still clawed, the cold still bit, but none of it touched the core of her anymore. On that sidewalk, she made an unspoken vow. The world might push her down again and again, but one day she would stand taller than its towers. Time reshaped the girl who once clutched sketches under flickering streetlights. Years of sleepless nights, cheap tea and relentless rejection had turned into contracts, respect and foundations dug deep into the earth. Where laughter once chased her from offices, now developers sought her vision, her signature, her name, and there it was, a tower of glass and steel standing proud against the sky. Nora stood before it, her reflection glimmering in every panel. She saw herself not as the broken girl of the streets, but as the architect who had carved her story into the skyline. Malik stood beside her, no longer the silent shadow who shared a blanket, but her partner, the man who carried her drawings when the world slammed doors. Together they had risen from hunger to horizons. The city that once mocked her now bowed to her towers. And for the first time, Nora felt taller than every skyscraper around her. Flashbulbs lit her face, microphones reached for her words. The world wanted to paint Nora as a self-made legend, a lone warrior who conquered the skyline. But she shook her head softly. "No," she said, "I wasn't alone. A stranger slept beside me when no one else did." Malik stood at the edge of the crowd, his quiet presence unchanged. Their bond, born from hunger and silence, had become the foundation of her empire. She refused to let history erase him, and she didn't stop there. Within her towers, she built floors for the forgotten, rooms where the homeless could find warmth, food, and dignity. To her, those weren't just shelters. They were monuments to nights of cold sidewalks and one torn blanket. Her wealth wasn't just measured in glass and steel. It was measured in the lives she lifted, beginning with the stranger who stayed. Nora's voice echoes like steel against the skyline. "The streets couldn't silence me, and neither will rejection silence you. Build your tower no matter how broken your ground.